Hello and assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Khalisah Harris-Shahid, founder of the Islamic Library Association. My work focuses on equitable and accurate Muslim representation in library and literary spaces. In this series, I'm in conversation with authors whose work centers Muslim women navigating divorce, those who have gone through it, or those supporting someone through it, and the importance of having resources that reflect those realities. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Suzy, who is the founding director of Cornerstone, a global nonprofit providing culturally and spiritually grounded therapeutic support for collectivist communities. She is an author, speaker, educator, and interventionist whose work focuses on marriage, family, emotional resilience, and faith centered care. Dr. Suzy, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Thank you so much, Dr. Khadisa. Assalamu alaikum to you and to the listeners. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well and I'm happy to join you this morning.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, to begin, can you introduce yourself and share a bit about the work that led you to write in this area?
So good opening question. um, So, you know, as many of us often reflect on our journeys and how we've gotten to where we currently are, it's usually not a linear path. It's usually very winding. And, you're kind of hit with the realization that Allah is the best of all planners because we plan and we plan, but, his guidance often leads us to the path that we're meant to take. Um, like many, children of Muslim parents in the Muslim American communities. I entered college in a pre-med program. It was a 7-year dual degree type program. And, my freshman year in college, I had gotten my schedule. This was back in the 90s. There was no internet really, early 90s, So I had a paper schedule, and one of the courses that I had on it said Intro to Communication. And it was supposed to be an Intro to Biomedical Ethics class. And I remember going to the registrar's office and asking, what is this class? I'm supposed to have this class instead. And they said, the Intro to Biomedical Ethics class was full. So just take the Intro to Com class and it'll count as one of your cores. So I went into the classroom having no idea like what this was or what, I was like, this is a joke. Like people study communication. And I was completely taken aback in that first lecture, as the
Mm.
professor. She had a British accent and everything sounds better in a British accent. But, she was speaking about like nonverbal communication in particular and its impact on
Mhm.
interpersonal dynamics and the way that when somebody stands, with their left shoulder turned towards someone as opposed to away, how that impacts them and the psychology behind nonverbal cues. And I was so fascinated by this. I couldn't believe that there was a study related to something I had always been interested in, which was, what makes people connect, what makes them click, why are some people drawn to others and some people repelled. Um, and that day, I went to the registrar's office, said, I'm dropping my major. I want to become a communication major.
Wow.
I think, many, many years later, I'm still explaining to my parents what I do because they're still not quite sure. So that was kind of, my undergrad journey. I wound up going deeper and deeper into the field of communication. I had no idea what I was going to do with it upon graduation. I just knew that I loved the study of communication. I also studied, Middle Eastern studies, Islam, English, writing, everything that I loved. I just wound
Mhm.
up, making that my focus in my undergrad work. And, then I kind of pursued graduate work because, again, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just knew that I loved learning in the field. And as kind of my journey continued and, into my completed my master's into my PhD program, I found myself really fascinated by studying relationships, understanding what makes things work and what makes them not work, and not the traditional counseling field. And so that's kind of how, through a very winding way, I found my way towards writing the book When Muslim Marriage Fails. That was my first adult book. My first actual book was a children's or a middle grade novel called The BFF Sisters, and that had come out in 2001. But yeah, that's kind of how I found my path. Just studying relationships and wanting to explore them more and learn more about them.
That's an excellent and an amazing path. Like you said, people are within spaces. that they didn't really expect or plan to be in.
Mhm.
And you said you even went into writing. You've written multiple books that speak directly to experiences that
Mhm.
many Muslim readers still struggle to find reflected clearly in
Mhm.
public spaces.
Yeah.
What keeps drawing you to this work specifically?
Yeah. So, growing up, I think, again, like many in our communities, books were my best friend. As my, other school friends maybe would be hanging out at each other's homes or going to parties. And, we lived a bit more of an insular life where our parents were very fearful of those who were not Muslim, who didn't look like us, who didn't speak like us. And so we spent a lot of time in libraries. And, the books I grew up reading were the Sweet Valley Twins and the Babysitters Club. And as much as I love those books, I always felt like there was something different. Like I couldn't see myself in those stories. I didn't have, blonde hair and blue eyes like Jessica and
Mhm.
Elizabeth. We didn't have, family breakfast in a Spanish tiled kitchen. So a lot of things just, didn't resonate with me. And so back in 2000, early 2001, when I was expecting my first child and I was on bed rest, I decided to write the book that I wanted my daughter to read. And that was the BFF Sisters, the first book that came about. And it was interesting because I often tell people I had September 11th, 2001 circled on my calendar long before it became, an infamous day in our history, because initially that was the launch date of my first book.
Oh,
It became the due date of my first daughter. And
mhm.
so, interestingly enough, the book, The BFF Sisters, which is a story of five American Muslim girls growing up in New Jersey, the publisher wound up pushing the launch date to December of 2001 instead because, of my due date. But it came out to like terrible reviews. And I remember like swearing that I'm never going to write another book again. Until fast forward many years later, I wound up writing adult, dramatized nonfiction instead.
You've written When Muslim Marriage Fails.
Mhm.
What did you feel the readers were not being given that made you write that book?
Yeah. So, in college, when I met my husband in college, and, I had seven friends, and he had seven friends, and the seven friends who were females and the seven friends who were males
Mhm.
all kind of married each other. And we
Okay.
all, had our weddings that same summer back in the 90s. We all scheduled them, a week apart so that we could be at each other's weddings. We all moved into the same apartment complex together. We took family vacations together. We started planning our families, trying to make sure our kids would be close in ages. And then about 7 years into our marriages, about 50% of that group had gotten divorced. And it wasn't something that we were familiar with or that we talked about because for most of us, we had grown up in family units that were functional, that maybe not, emotional compatibility between our parents, but they made it work. Even if they weren't thrilled with each other, they stayed married. And now suddenly in this generation, we were seeing that if a marriage wasn't working, divorce was an option. And, Islamically, we know that divorce is permissible, but it felt very much like a taboo. And this book came out in 2010. So it was, alhamdulillah, I'm happy to say we've progressed since that time. But, I started kind of looking into what was happening, why were marriages, within our communities breaking apart at a rate of almost 50%. And currently it is still close to about 50%. So, I didn't actually set out initially to make it a book open to the public. This was part of my dissertation research, and I was focusing on, more just a research oriented interpersonal approach. But as the book kind of came together, I started feeling like, wait, this is something that maybe would help others. And so, long story short, I remember I had called my publisher back then, saying my oldest daughter was about 9 years old then, and she was telling me like, "Mom, you keep writing." these like research articles, like, when are you going to write something good again? And she was referring back to the BFF sisters. And so I remember I had called my publisher at the time and I said, hey, I think I'm ready to continue the BFF sisters series, because it was initially signed as a series, but when it came out to really bad reviews in 2001, I was like, I'm not doing this. So the publisher had said, we've closed our children's division. Do you have anything in the adult side? And that's when I kind of thought, wait, I think I do, And so that's how When Muslim Marriage Fails came to be. And it was really just trying to address the difficulties that we see in marriages. And what is it that could cause, couples who maybe had, grown up together, known each other, followed very similar blueprints. Why would some marriages work and some not? And really exploring the communication elements of that in particular.
Hmm, very great observation. And again, everything you're saying goes back to not planning
Mm.
on where you end up being and what you end up doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned also how, you know, 50% of the friend group ended in divorce, and you were going to write another book for your daughter, and then you
Hmm.
realized you had something else.
Yeah.
What do you believe is missing when Muslim readers need language for
Hmm.
that divorce or those difficult relationships, but can't find themselves reflected on the shelves?
Yeah. So I think, what was interesting when this book came out, again, I was coming at it from a very research minded perspective, like looking at the intricacies of communication, value dimensions, and how differing value dimensions play out. For example, something like, time orientation, someone who is polychronic, who sees time as very fluid, and someone who is monochronic, who sees time as very much a fixed entity. SubhanAllah, we do see opposites attracting, and we tend to see people who are on opposite spectrums of value dimensions being drawn together. But then we see problems arising when there is a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, a lack of recognition of how these differences can actually enhance a marriage rather than breaking it apart. So I think, when this book came out, again, very research focused, very focused on kind of naming, utilizing theories, what it is that happens in marriages that can cause breakdowns. I started getting phone calls, but pretty soon after its release, from different communities, throughout the U.S., different organizations, even not always Muslim. I remember one of the first organizations that asked me to give a book talk was the Roman Catholic Church in our area, and the question that I kept getting was things like, my marriage looks just like chapter 4 in your book. Tell me what to do, or oh my goodness, chapter 2 was exactly what I went through. Should I get a divorce? And
Mm.
I remember, like, I would get these requests, whether it was from imams, from community members, from random organizations. And my response was always like, I don't know, I'm an academic. I'm not a counselor. You should go to counseling probably. And the response was always like, we went to counseling and it didn't work, or a counselor made things worse. And that's when I started realizing that there's something bigger in collectivist communities. Again, not just Muslim communities, but communities that come from very we-centric perspectives, where there is more focus on the togetherness rather than the self, and that there are a lot of struggles that develop when collectivist communities are trying to maintain their outlook in a tide that is very individualistic. Our society is very individualistic. And that's kind of how Cornerstone was born. Cornerstone was actually born from the problems and difficulties in relationships that, kept coming to the forefront after the book came about. So I think the book was the conversation starter that maybe started the dialogue on a topic that we don't often dive too deeply into. And then, Cornerstone was the outcome, which is the organization I run that provides alternative therapeutic interventions.
That's amazing. That's wonderful work. And based upon everything that you have done thus far, what do you think becomes possible when readers encounter literature that actually reflects the religious, cultural, and emotional realities that they're navigating?
Yeah. So, again, I think it goes back maybe to like my roots in communication studies, and, knowing how important it is to be able to tell your story and to find the right words to capture what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. I can't tell you how many times I've had couples, when I explain to them, just for example, the contextualism theory, the idea of someone being polychronic and someone being monochronic and how that can impact your outlook in life. And I see them like nodding, like there's the light bulb that goes off and they say, yes, yes, this is exactly what we've been struggling with. And I think, first of all, it brings to reality the fact that you're not alone, that there are things that you're experiencing maybe in your relationships, whether it's as a parent and a child, whether it's, in a marriage, or whether it's, those struggling with emotional resilience, that are shared experiences, that you're not going through this alone. And I think when you see it in print, when you read words that capture your experience, it's a lot less lonely. And I think that's a big part of what reading helps us do.
Definitely. You mentioned previously how when you first prepared the book, it was not necessarily meant to be for the public.
Hmm.
Um, After, different experiences and things like that, you're like, maybe this should be part of, available to the public.
Yeah.
Tell me now why books like yours should be part of the standard within public libraries, typical divorce collections, opposed to being treated as niche or
Mhm.
supplementary.
Yeah. I think it goes back to, what I was saying earlier, that one of the first locations that asked me to speak about this subject was the Roman Catholic Church. And when their outreach coordinator had reached out to me, they said, we have a huge problem with divorce in our community, and we've tried to tackle it from so many different areas. So we figure maybe we should get a Muslim perspective on it now. And I've heard that over and over again, that despite the book being called, When Muslim Marriage Fails, so many of the elements that it captures ties back to a wider audience, not just the Muslim community. My next book that came out after When Muslim Marriage Fails is called 9 to 5 Muslims in the Western Workplace. And again, that book came with the perspective, post 9/11, living in, and I had spent some time in the corporate world as well, dealing with kind of workplace aggressions and issues of organizational communication. It was focused primarily on, that was a book for the public, but focused primarily on a Muslim audience. Among the first places that I gave book talks on that, book was actually Goldman Sachs. I've done, several other high level organizations, and corporations that would invite me in to speak about the topic of ethnic minorities in the workplace, Muslims and those of other faiths. And that made me realize that, again, the topics that we address in our Muslim communities, or the Muslim centric approach, maybe have values that really cross bridges and can be used as conversational elements where there's so much similitude that is established, because our human problems, I think, are universal, whether it is problems in relationships, problems at work, problems in raising our children. The struggles that we have are so similar. Maybe there's certain things that we go about in different ways, but at the heart of it, it's so often communication and just miscommunication, misperception, misunderstanding that's born of, again, different value dimensions that clash. So I think these are books that cross boundaries. Maybe a change in title in the next editions would help,
Yeah.
because sometimes you see a book and you think it's directed towards a specific community, but it actually encompasses so many other faith communities and cultures as well.
Definitely. I'm sure that those things matter, especially when it comes to, just like you said, just the title and understanding who it's for. We say quite often how, Muslim books, quote unquote, are not solely for Muslims,
Mhm.
because Muslims, we're human. And like you're saying, some of those experiences and daily life, some of those things are very, very similar. So we can relate to one another as humans, even if the faith per se may not be identical.
Yeah.
And with situations like this, why does public access matter here?
Mhm.
Why shouldn't readers have to rely on private networks to find books like this?
So, I think back again to like my childhood, and, at that time, there really were not too many Muslim authors. Again, I'm a child of like the late 70s and early 80s. So when I was reading books, there was one mainstream, point of view that was kind of presented in children's books, in the books that we read in school, in, our literature studies. It probably wasn't until like my ninth grade world history class in high school where we were actually assigned to read books that were translated. So books by authors that were not American or British, and read translations of them, that I started to see like there was a whole world of books out there that weren't coming from the same point of view. And reading those books again, I wouldn't have thought to look for books of that sort if it wasn't a school assignment, in ninth grade world history honors class.
Yes.
And I think introducing like world literature, understanding authors of different points of views, even reading translated works, or better yet, like learning the language and then reading works in that language. Those were experiences that began for me in college when I intentionally, again, once I dropped out of the med program, my schedule really freed up. So I was able to take every class that looked interesting. And again, I didn't know what I was going to do. So I didn't actually declare a major. Like I knew I wanted to study communication, but I was just randomly taking classes. So by the time it was my junior year in college, I remember I was called into the registrar's office again, and they said, "You've already completed the credits for 3 majors. Like you can't take any more undergrad classes." And at that point, apparently I was an English major, a communication major, and a Middle Eastern studies major. And it was only because I pursued things that I was interested in. And then I had to track into the master's program, at that point. But I think if we open doors, and especially for our youth, and have them understand that there are so many realms that exist maybe outside of the one point of view, one perspective. I
Mhm.
think that's why we see so many young people these days drawn into fantasy worlds in terms of reading, or even, the online access and video gaming. The idea that there is something else out there, a perspective, a point of view that's not a mainstream, white American, white English speaking perspective. And again, we've made huge strides from what I had access to back way back when to what our youth have access to today. But I think we can always do more, and we can always, push out more of those differing perspectives.
Mhm. I agree. And you're saying that there's more available to, this generation of Muslim children per se. Yes, there are more Muslim authors,
Yeah.
and that's great and very important. And it's equally important to have them accessible within public spaces. It seems like a lot of the Muslim books are within smaller communities or Muslim communities,
Mhm.
opposed to saying, hey, these books, everyone can use these books,
Yeah.
everyone can read these books the same way we have access to different perspectives.
Mhm.
You know, people of other faiths and everyday living should have access to our books,
Mhm.
especially in those public spaces that, you know, enhance or claim to be equitable, diverse, and inclusive. We should be in those spaces.
Mhm.
So you have children's books, adult books,
Yeah.
different genres.
Mm.
Where can people find your work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't looked up my books in quite some time, but I know, I believe they're on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. So the original places in which you could find them. I think they're Kindle books as well. I know they are available. The newest editions are available as Apple books now, and you can get that off of our website, which is cornercounseling.com. And that's counseling with one L, because I know the British spell it with two L's. So I always get emails saying, I can't find your website. But yes, so cornercounseling.com, you can find the books there. They are in the process of becoming audiobooks through Chapters, which is a platform that creates audiobooks. So that should be hopefully before the end of this year, inshallah, all 4 books will be released as audiobooks as well.
Alhamdulillah. Well, Dr. Susie, thank you so much for joining me today and for offering insight and care around an experience that is too often left unspoken and unsupported. Conversations like this remind us that representation is not simply about visibility, it's also about access, recognition, and the ability to find ourselves reflected in the resources meant to serve us. Thank you again for your time and for the work that you continue to do.
Thank you, Dr. Khalisah. It was very nice talking to you. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah. Walaikum salam. Join the Islamic Library Association, and together we can shape a more inclusive future for literature.